Good morning and welcome to the next session of Understanding LDS History, where we are looking at the pioneer years of LDS history together from 1844 to 1877. And we're in a little detour right now where we have spent the last few weeks looking at the early life of Brigham Young, that he is such an important figure in LDS history and in American history that we're getting to know him a little bit better. And we'll get back to 1844 in a week or two. As always, though, I just like to mention my intent in all of this and always in this class, I hope I can pull it off, is we'll talk about things that we may disagree with our LDS friends and neighbors on, but we want to keep the scriptural admonition to do that with gentleness and with respect. And hopefully what all of us are looking for, whether you're an evangelical Christian or you're LDS or you're just seeking the truth, all truths. There's not a single truth in the whole world that is true because I believe it to be true. Not one truth is made true because I believe it. And yet in our culture a lot of times we tend to think, well, this is what I believe and so it must be true. And what we're trying to get at in this class is what actually is true regarding history, what really happened. Historical truths aren't any different than any other truth in the world, right? Either Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated JFK or he didn't, and he wasn't a lone gunman. But whatever the truth is, it's true regardless of what you believe about it. And we're trying to get to that kind of truth as we look at LDS history together. I always want to keep the encouragement of Colossians. I hope I can be gracious in my speech. If you are in this room or you are watching this online and you disagree, I would love to get together. We can have a cup of coffee, we can sit down and talk, and we can disagree without being disagreeable and be gracious as we work through looking for truth together. And so I hope I find that balance in these classes every week. We left off last week with, in the winter of 1839, the church was run out of far west Missouri following Governor Boggs' extermination order, where the militia came to town and said, you will leave or else. And so they were forced to flee, and in that winter, thousands of saints fled Missouri. Most of them made their way back towards Illinois because Illinois had offered them refuge. And the moving factor in a lot of that and just the logistics of all of that and making it happen was Brigham Young. Joseph Smith and all the first presidency were in prison, and so a large part of the burden fell on him. And so he was instrumental in that. And at the end of the day, the saints had settled in eastern Iowa, Commerce, Iowa area, Illinois. They would eventually settle in Nauvoo, but they're scattered all over that area. But as soon as they got them moved over there, Brigham and the rest of the apostles snuck back to far west, which was an abandoned city at this point in time. They snuck back into far west for a very important reason. In Brigham's words, they snuck back in order to help the Lord fulfill his prophecy. Because the previous summer, Joseph Smith had made this prophecy regarding something that would happen in far west that spring. The previous summer, Joseph Smith had given this revelation where God is saying, next spring let them, that's the apostles, let the apostles depart and go over the great waters and there promulgate my gospel, the fullness thereof, and bear record of my name, and let them take leave of my saints in the city of far west on the 26th day of April next year. That's very specific, right? Next spring on April 26th, you leave from far west to go on this mission on the building spot of my house. Now, when Smith had made that prophecy, he was very optimistic that there was going to be a temple built and far west would be, become the great center of LDS activity in life while they were waiting to get back into independence. So everything was optimistic when he made that prophecy on July 8th. But by the time April 26th of 1839 rolled around, things were quite different. And so this is how they had to kind of help God in his prophecy a little bit. So under cover of darkness, they went back, and early on the morning of April 26th, Brigham and the other apostles snuck back into Far West, literally taking their life in their own hands to do so if they had been caught. They snuck back in. They went to the site where the temple was supposed to be built, and no work had ever been done on the temple that was supposed to be built there. So they got a big boulder and they rolled it in place as the cornerstone of the temple. That's how little work had actually been done. But they laid a cornerstone for the temple. They excommunicated 30 people who hadn't been loyal. They appointed Wilford Woodruff and George Smith as apostles. And you might remember, their numbers of the 12 have been decimated by all the dissenters and people who've left the church and the hubbub over the banking scandal and everything we talked about last week. So they appointed Wilford Woodruff and George Smith as apostles. This is a really important decision. Both of those names would be very prominent in LDS history for a long time to come. Wilford Woodruff would become the 4th president of the church eventually. George Smith, who was Brigham's first cousin. You might have heard a little town down south called St. George. That St. George is named after George Smith, who after they settled in Missouri and Smith, they're colonizing, or Missouri, Utah. They're colonizing it. Smith is the one who helped coordinate the efforts and send the families down there that colonized St. George. And he would have a big hand to play in the Mountain Meadows Massacre, which we will eventually get to at some point in the future. They were appointed as apostles, and that, in hindsight, was a big, big decision because they go on to become very influential people. And they prayed together, and they left. And so they felt like they had helped that prophecy be fulfilled. By the time they got back to Quincy, where most of the saints were, they were reunited with Joseph Smith, who by this time, all the Mormons left. And Joseph Smith and the First Presidency are in jail, and Missouri authorities were essentially like, we really don't need the publicity of this trial and everything. And so they kind of looked the other way and allowed Joseph Smith to escape. And so he had escaped from prison and made his way back. And Brigham was delighted to see him. He said, "It was one of the most joyful scenes of my life to once more strike hands with the prophets and behold them from the hands of their enemy, and behold them free from the hands of their enemies. Smith conversed with us like a man who had just escaped from 1,000 oppressions and was now free in the midst of his children." So, they had a very happy reunion. And one thing you see happening in this period is, we've talked about before, and I'll bring it up again, that outside of the principle of ongoing revelation from God, the principle of gathering was maybe the distinguishing doctrine of the LDS Church in the 1830s and even for the next few decades. That the early LDS movement was very much a millennial movement built around the fact that we must gather together. We have to gather the saints in preparation for the return of Jesus, which was supposed to happen within that first generation of saints' lifetime. We must gather. We must build a new Jerusalem so that Jesus will come back. And so it hasn't worked out well for them, but everywhere, right? Joseph Smith taught you've got to gather in Independence, Missouri, and in Kirtland. But they had been run out of both of those places. Then we have to all gather in Far West, and they assembled all the saints there. And now they've been run out of Far West. For all the reasons we've talked about, right? Thousands and thousands of LDS members moving into a new area made things politically uncomfortable for the people who weren't LDS, and they ended up being persecuted everywhere they went. And so they knew by this point in time they were smart enough to look around and see things don't go very well when we gather. But it was such an important principle that they refused to give it up. And it'd be an important principle for Brigham Young in having the saints gather here in Utah. And so we'll continue to see that theme. And so they've been forced to flee, but they would eventually again start gathering in Nauvoo, or what would become Nauvoo in Illinois. But Brigham has to go to England, along with all the other apostles, in fulfillment of that prophecy. And I guess technically they departed on April 26th, but it would be a while before them actually getting there. Their plans were derailed that summer, that first summer in Illinois, Iowa. The area where they'd settled was swampland, and malaria was just mowing them down. And it went through, and at one point all of the apostles were sick. Joseph Smith was sick, and people were dying, and it was pretty bad. Brigham's wife was sick, his kids were sick, and if you've ever had malaria, I've never had malaria. I've known a few people that have. Malaria is not like the flu where you feel bad for a couple days and then you get better. It can take months and months to recover from malaria. So a lot of them were sick that summer. And Heber Kimball recorded that at one point, though, Joseph Smith got up from his own sick bed, and he went out and took the sick by hand, and he commanded the fever to depart from them, and people leapt up from their beds and were made whole, and they were healed. And Brigham said Smith did that for him, that Smith commanded me in the name of Jesus to arise and be made whole, and it was truly a time of rejoicing. But the rejoicing didn't last long, because nobody was really better. And I don't know if psychosomatically they felt better as a result of that for a while, but, right, the malaria, nobody was really better. And Young and many of the apostles continued to be sick throughout the summer. Young and Kimball eventually left for England in mid-September, right after Mary Ann had given birth to their 7th child, 10 days beforehand. A little girl named Alice, who they often called Emma. I'm assuming after Joseph Smith's wife, Emma. So you can imagine, 10 days after she was born, he's leaving her and their 7 kids. And when I say he left them poor, I don't mean he left them poor. He left them with nothing. I mean, dirt poor. They were living in an abandoned army barracks in Commerce, Iowa, that wasn't, I mean, it was drafty, it wasn't fully roofed, it leaked. It was not good living conditions with 7 little kids. She's sick, the kids are sick. Brigham was still sick when they left. And the church said, we'll take care of your families. But the problem was they didn't have anything to take care of them with. They didn't have the funds or the means to do that either. And Brigham felt bad about that. He wrote to Mary Ann not long after they left. He said, this is almost robbing you. But I don't know what else to do. I've got to go to be obedient. And so he left. He was still sick when they left. He said, when I started on my mission to England, my health was so poor I was unable to go 30 rods to the river without assistance. I left my wife sick with a babe only 10 days old and all my children sick and unable to wait upon each other. Not even able to take care of each other. And just remember when we talk about this, that's what my mind keeps going back to, what the wives went through. He's going to be gone for 1.5 years when this is all said and done. And she is just trying to survive. There's one account that in that first winter that he was gone, she had shown up at the tithing office, freezing to death and delirious, and just crying, going, I don't know what to do. I can't take care of my family. I got nothing to eat. And all they were able to give her, she left with like a potato and a couple other little scraps. And that's how they're trying to survive while he is away. So it was hard on all of them. Heber and Brigham were both, in the first few months after they left, on and off deathly ill and weak still, and trying to keep each other going. So everybody was sick. Brigham talked about it in several letters to Mary Ann. He wrote in one, you wrote in your letter that your health was very poor and you're wasting away, and this hurts my feelings. I don't know if he'd hurt his feelings that she said she was sick, or I think he's just saying, right, this hurts me to know that you're sick. I dreamt the other night that you was dead. I waked myself up a-weeping and lay awake while meditating upon our life past and present. So it was hard for all of them to be gone from their families. But it wasn't totally without humor. And I just want to share this one because this one brings a smile to my face. One letter, apparently he was not happy that he wasn't getting more letters from Marianne. So he's kind of in a fun way giving her a hard time about it. He says, Brother Kimball just received a letter from his wife, but Brother Brigham has received but one since he left home. I am persuaded that he, talking about himself, I am persuaded that he loves his wife and children as well as any other man if he doesn't quite make so much fuss about it. Mary, I'm almost a mind to write you a love letter and see if that will not bring an answer, as Brother Orson Pratt has already got 6 or 8 letters from his wife. And I'm not getting any. So, long story short, they spent several months visiting and evangelizing in Pennsylvania and New York. And so it would be March of 1840 before they got on a ship for England, along with Kimball and Parley and Orson Pratt, George Smith. They sailed for England. When they got there, they were met by Wilford Woodruff and John Taylor, who had already arrived ahead of them. When they arrived, they ordained Willard Richards as an apostle. And so at that point, 8 of the 11 apostles were all in England together. And they all affirmed Brigham as their standing president. He's the guy in charge. And this is where, in England, we really begin to see Brigham's talents and skills begin to shine. And by that I mean his skills as an organizer and a planner and able to see big picture. I've said this before. Joseph Smith was, he's very impetuous, right? And he shot from the hip a lot, and he reacted to situations a lot. But Brigham Young was able to see the big picture and go, I've got a plan, and here's what we need to do, and organize other people. And that's why I really think that had Smith lived, I don't know that the church would have survived. But under Brigham was just such a masterful planner, and we see that in England while they were there. It wasn't always easy, though. He said, I had an interview with a priest, one a Baptist and the other a Methodist, but they're just like the rest of the priests. They've just enough religion to damn them. No inclination to even inquire after the gospel of Jesus Christ. This is a wicked place, but there are a few that want to be saved. And I'd say this about quotes like that. He said a lot more inflammatory things like that. We'll see later. As a Baptist, that does not offend me in the least that he would say that. Because if Brigham is right and my views are wrong, I am damned. So I'm not offended. He believes that. I'm not offended by it. In the same way, conversely, if what we believe is right and what Brigham Young believed is wrong, right, they're damned. And so again, we're talking about matters of truth here, the most important questions in the world. I'm not offended that he said that. And I think sometimes the difficulty for us in talking is we live in such the highest virtue in our age is just be nice. And don't ever say anything that could possibly be offensive to anybody in any context. And you can't get at truth that way. And in reality, if in any area I am doing you a service and I am loving on you if you are in error and I can correct it and help you to the truth. That's true if I'm helping you with your math homework or your science homework, or if I'm teaching you how to know the true and living God. And so we have to keep that in mind when we have conversations with each other. We can talk and we can be civil, but we can also be honest. And he at least initially found, and he found this among the religious leaders because they made huge inroads into the Baptist and Methodist church. So they were not happy and receptive to the message, but a lot of other people were. And just in the first few months after he arrived, the Herefordshire branch, which was the one where they had the most success in that area, it grew from 33 churches to of 540 members. By October, it would be 70 churches with more than 1,000 members there in England. They had a great success, and largely among the poor. And there was a lot of desperately poor people in England in the 1840s. I mean, desperately, desperately poor. What had happened in England, if you know history at all, right? The Industrial Revolution, the Industrial Age is dawning, and machinery and factories are taking over the world, right? And especially England was in the forefront of all of that. So you have these massive factories going up that are automating things that people had used for their livelihood for centuries and centuries and centuries. Cottage industries and careers, right? Little tiny family farms that you could subside on. Or maybe you were a cobbler. Or maybe you were a seamstress or you sewed, right? All these things people would support their family on. Now it's all being mechanized. And as a result, people have flocked to the cities by the millions. And London especially, this time, the big cities in England were just cesspools. Millions of people living in tenements with almost no sanitation. And there's accounts of there's so much coal from all the factories that everything's black and everything's sooty, right? The air quality was horrible. Child labor, where kids are working 60 or 70 hours a week at 10 or 12 years old in these factories, just so their families could survive. So just people were desperately, desperately poor. And those poor people responded to the LDS message. This will give you an idea how bad it was. I told you what Marianne was going through a little bit and how poor they were in America, but this is what Brigham said. I forget how many beggars I saw, but enough to take all the pennies and coppers I can get. When I look at the difference between poor people here in America, I rejoice that you and the children are there. Even he realized it's a whole lot better to be poor in America than it is to be poor here. Well, the situation was very desperate. And they wanted to help them. And they wanted to help all these poor new converts get to America. But they didn't know, is that what we should be doing, right? And back to that principle of gathering. And so they sent a letter to the first presidency going, do you want us to tell all these saints, these converts in England, do they need to be gathering to America? And they wrote with that question. They wrote to Joseph Smith, Brethren, our hearts are pained with the poverty and the misery of this people. And we've done all we could to help as many as possible to a land where they may get a morsel of bread and serve God according to his appointment. And we have done it cheerfully as unto the Lord, and we desire to ask you, have we done right? Or is it the right principle for us to act upon to involve ourselves to help the poor saints to Zion? So, have we done the right thing? Do you want us sending these people there? Should these saints in England be gathering? And later that year, the first presidency, Joseph Smith sent a message back that they entitled A Proclamation to the Saints Scattered Abroad. And there's several things doctrinally that I think are important in this statement. So if you'll forgive me, I'm going to read a large excerpt from it. This was his response to those saints in England. This was published in the Millennial Star, which was the English LDS newspaper that they started while Brigham was there. This was the response. And I don't know if you can see that in the back. Have my slides not been working the whole time? And nobody has said anything to me this whole time? You guys are all just looking at me? They're working great on my screen. You're like, the slides are so boring today. Let me see if I can fix that. I apologize. Man, they were great slides too. Would have changed your life. Now it won't even let me out of the program. We'll get it. We'll get it. Daniel, when you're doing the video, you can exit this out. All right, maybe we won't get it. I think it's on the TV side. Well, I apologize. You'll have to listen close here. So I guess you can't read it and follow along on the screen. I apologize for that. So they sent this proclamation to the saints scattered abroad, and here's part of what it said. Smith says, having been instrumental in laying the hands of our Heavenly Father in laying the foundation for the gathering of Zion, we would say, let all of those who appreciate the blessings of the gospel and realize the importance of obeying the commandments of heaven, who have been blessed of heaven with the possessions of this world's goods, first prepare for the general gathering. And then he goes on to say, because they can come and start businesses and get busy with manufacturing and everything, and then send the poor. So he says, send first the people who have money and who have means, because when they get here, they can be productive and have some means to help the poor make a living. He goes on to say, as watchmen to the house of Israel, as shepherds over the flock, which is now scattered, and the anxiety we feel for their prosperity and everlasting welfare, blah, 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 for carrying out the purposes of God, we feel to urge its necessity and say, let the saints come here. This is the word of the Lord, and this is from God, and in accordance with the great work of the last days. And he's saying, God says for them to gather. And again, the idea that this is the last days. He does go on to say it's true that the idea of gathering has been associated with cruel and oppressing scenes owing to our unrelenting persecution at the hands of wicked men, but we hope that those days of darkness and gloom have gone. So it's going to be different this time. And so send them here. In addition to all the temporal blessings, there's no other way for the saints to be saved in these last days. As the prophets testify, and he quotes a couple verses, that this is the way the saints will be saved, is by gathering. And so, yes, send them here. It's also the testimony of the prophets that this gathering together of the saints must take place before the Lord comes to take vengeance on the ungodly. So again, we have to gather to usher in the millennium, and Jesus is going to return. This was the consistent message of the church over and over and over for the first 6 decades, at least through the life of Brigham Young. I don't know when they moved away from that message, but it was the consistent message of the church. We have to gather, we have to gather, we have to gather, because we're ushering in the millennium, and Jesus is going to come back any day. And I don't know if it was just a deal that when it became evident, maybe he's not. But there's huge false prophecy here issues, right? Where the leaders are saying Jesus is returning in our lifetime, and it doesn't happen. But again, the consistent emphasis was you got to gather, you got to gather, you got to gather, so Jesus could come back. So Brigham began to work on a plan for how to get them from England to America. Like I said, they had huge success in terms of converts in England, and I'll share the numbers with you in just a second. But I think part of the reason why, there's 2 things that went hand in hand with this, I think. It wasn't just people responding to the Mormon gospel as much as it was people also responding to the American dream. And those 2 things went hand in hand with, I think, a lot of these people who came who were so desperately poor and no hope. And it's the beginning of the Victorian era in England, and if you were the upper class, you were doing great, but if you were poor without hardly any hope of getting out of poverty, right? And what's the American dream? Right? In America, anybody can do anything. In America, even the poor can work hard and make a success of themselves, right? And so you've got that tied with New Jerusalem and Jesus coming back, and get to America and we can get free from this poverty. It's a very appealing picture for people who are desperately poor. And I think that had a big role to play in it. That they're offering us a way out of this, what they were suffering through right then. Most of the English saints needed no encouragement, Brigham Young said, to gather, to go to America. They didn't need much encouraging. he said they've got to, nothing can stop them. They have so much of the spirit of gathering that they would just go if they knew they would die as soon as they got there, or if they knew that the mob would be upon them and drive them as soon as they got there. They have the spirit of the times here as well as the church there. He said, I'm not even having to encourage them to go. They're ready to go to America. So in February of 1841, they had chartered the ship, the Sheffield, and it left for America with 235 saints on board. And here's what Young and Taylor and Richards had coordinated. They coordinated the chartering of an entire ship, purchasing all of the provisions for the journey, and making sure those provisions were all loaded. They arranged for an American elder to be on the ship to go with them to kind of act as a guide when they got to the States and get them to Illinois and help them with any issues that they had along the way. A massive amount of coordination involved to do this. But they did it, and they kind of used that as a process they would refine in the months ahead, where he developed this whole system of immigration where they would book the whole ship, pay for all the provisions on the ship, make arrangements for all the travel once they got to the States, and they always had an elder in the church with them on the ship to kind of be their guide and be the person in charge. And they did it so well, because remember, these people are desperately poor. They did it so well that they worked out a system where they could get somebody from England to America for about 4 or 5 English pounds, which is about $20 in today's currency. Isn't that amazing? That they figured out a way to do that. And those poor saints worked and scraped, and they came up for ways, ones that didn't even have that, to be able to do it. And so they began this process of sending all of these converts over. We ended up being there for about 1.5 years. I wish I could show you all this. 1.5 years later, so in April of 1841, all the apostles gathered for one last conference before they were going to return back to America. And here were the numbers for that last conference. At that last conference, it was reported a membership in the church in England of 6,674, which was an increase in a little over a year of 5,133. That was the kind of success Brigham had had while they were in England. They'd already sent over 1,000 converts to America by the time Brigham left for home. And here is what he said afterward. We landed as strangers in a strange land and penniless, but through the mercy of God we've gained many friends, established churches in almost every noted town and city in the great kingdom of Great Britain. We've baptized between 7,000 and 8,000, printed 5,000 books of Mormon, 3,000 hymn books, 2,500 volumes of the Millennial Star, and 50,000 tracts, and immigrated to Zion over 1,000 souls. Established a permanent shipping agency, which will be a great blessing to the saints. Not a bad year's work. And you begin to see, right, Brigham's talent starting to shine in this period. Is why I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about it. So shortly thereafter in April, Brigham and the rest of the apostles would head back for the United States. I think it would be September before he finally made it home. So closer to 2 years that he had been away from his family. Parley Pratt was chosen to stay there and oversee the work in America. But by the time Brigham made it home, a while has passed. Nauvoo has become established as a city. And when he gets back to Nauvoo, we're going to find things are changing and changing fast. And that's where we're going to pick it up next week. Where I think next week we can get caught up on the Nauvoo area and we'll get back all the way. We'll get back to our 1844. But next week he gets back to Nauvoo and finds out Joseph Smith is teaching some way different things than he has ever taught before. And is Brigham going to be able to get on board with 4 major new doctrines that would develop in that period of time? So we'll look at the Nauvoo years together next week. But thank you for being here. I apologize again for the slides, but I can hang out and answer any questions you might have. God bless you. Have a good week.